that's going. This is a program that kind of grew out of research we were doing when we were, it's like 10 years ago. My wife didn't believe me when I told her, but I got the files from when I went back and did the research. But we were doing research for what was then the remodeling of the Permanent History Gallery on the second floor. That's pretty much the way the gallery is to this day. And I was looking into some story about workers, and I had never heard about this, and I stumbled onto it. Right about that time, my wife Sharon Carlson is the director at the University Archives up at the Zhang Collection Center, and she said, well, there's this collection up here that Plaza Corp gave to the archives that they found over. Plaza Corp at that time, maybe still does, owns the old Shakespeare buildings, Shakespeare's Pub being just one of them. And they had this collection of old clippings that they found, and it looked historical. They gave it to the archives. And so I started looking at it, and I thought, this could be a fun story. And I researched it then. I did a program on it then. I've done a little bit more this year for a number of reasons, not quite as much additional research, but some that I had hoped. And it's the story of a strike at the Shakespeare Company in 1948, a strike that fell right in the beginning years of the Cold War. So for those anti-communist warriors who were coming into political force those days, this strike and the events surrounding this strike were evidence of red terrorism, communist terrorism, and it was right here in Kalamazoo. Now, did I turn this on? No. There we go, I think. Yeah. The company, the Shakespeare Company, was founded by this man, William Shakespeare Jr. I've circled him over there. This is Mr. Shakespeare in his later years. At that time, he was one of the commissioners on the Kalamazoo City Commission. The company he founded was in 1896. It was a manufacturer of fishing equipment, rods, reels. It grew over the years into a variety of things. Mr. Shakespeare, at the time of the strike, had retired. His son was running the company, but he did have an office down at the Shakespeare Company office. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. But what was the strike? Well, here's where roughly 1946, this is kind of an undated photo, but it's about what you would have seen at the Shakespeare Company on Kalamazoo Avenue at the time of the strike. High overhead, but if you're familiar with that area in Kalamazoo, which of course in those days was two-way traffic, this is the Shakespeare office building. Today is the Shakespeare Pub. This building here is gone. It's become some parking, but this building over here still stands. There's, I think, an advertising firm located in there. And then you can see as you're looking down, Michigan Avenue, here's the Rickman House. This is the Park Trade Center. The steeples here would be the old St. Augustine's. So we know that puts it before the mid-1950s when St. A's was built on its current location. That's the original location. So that's a little bit of a look at it from Michigan, from Kalamazoo Avenue. Here you are from the back side, the railroad track side, looking at the company. The Shakespeare Company is a large company. This is a 1936 photo of the interior of the factory. A lot of routine work. At the time of the strike, Shakespeare management said there were really not very many skilled jobs. It was mostly unskilled labor, machine work, people working on machines. They did, I'm not sure if they considered these men skilled or not, but they said most of their workers were unskilled workers. The timeline of events, well, in 1945, Shakespeare had been under pressure by union organizers to have a union, and Shakespeare resisted. One of the ways that management resisted unions was to organize a company union. The company would organize one and say, this is the union, and we'll sit down and talk about all of our issues together. We don't need those outsiders from the CIO or the AFL or any other big outside union. We can solve these problems ourselves. Shakespeare organized its own company union. It had been under some pressure. In 1943, the United Auto Workers appealed to the National Labor Relations Board to have an election. I have not been able to find what the outcome of that election was. Other than that, there was no union organized. UAW, well, there really are two companies in the Shakespeare companies in Kalamazoo. There's Shakespeare Company, which manufactured the fishing equipment and some other sporting goods, and Shakespeare Products Company, which manufactured automobile parts. So that's how the UAW got involved. But nothing comes of that. Also in 1945, the United Steelworkers applied for a union there. Again, the union is not, well, the election is held in 46, and finally in 47, the United Steelworkers of America, CIO, for those of you not familiar with your labor history, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations were separate organizations until 1954. The AFL was the older and generally considered more conservative, more traditional, kind of organized on a craft or a trade basis. The best example of a way to think about that is if in a big factory you've got, or a big company, you've got electrical workers and plumbers and this, that, and the other, all of them would have their own union. But if you go to an automobile, one of the big auto plants today, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You're an auto worker. Yeah, and that's an industrial union. So the difference between an industrial and a trade or a craft union, and industrial unions were what were sweeping the country beginning in the 1930s, coming out of the Great Depression. So Shakespeare then negotiated a one-year contract in 1947. Oh, and I mentioned this already. They manufactured fishing and sporting goods, plus then the products. I think I had it backwards, but no, manufactured automobile parts. These aren't the only Shakespeare products. They also were manufacturing some airline controls, and that company had moved, or that division had been moved to Burbank, California during the war years. And if you're wondering why, well, here in Michigan, we're familiar, I think, with the Willow Run bomber plant that Henry Ford built out there. But really the locus of American aviation manufacturing was on the West Coast, in the LA area during the war years, heavily out there. Contract expired in July of 1948. Negotiations begin, go nowhere. In September, the day after Labor Day, the Tuesday after Labor Day, the local 3619 of the steelworkers strikes both companies, Shakespeare Company and Shakespeare Products. The union says that out of the 700 or 800 employees were employed at those two plants, at least 500 were members of the union. They had not gotten exclusive representation rights yet with the company. That is, they were not a closed shop in union parlance. But the company, on the other hand, claimed that really there's only 250 out of all those people who are members of the union. And the company continued to work, continued to operate, and hired replacement workers for the strikers. On the 9th, after a little bit of disturbances, Judge Archie McDonald, who was actually out of Hastings, but was brought down here because he would be impartial to a strike in which too many local people were involved on sides, and could you really fairly say that that the local judges would be impartial? They're supposed to be, but we all know, especially in a smaller community. So he issued an injunction that said pickets you could have 2 pickets at each entrance, and there were 12 entrances to the buildings. There had been periodic clashes and disturbances. I'll show you a couple pictures in just a second. And also in September, in an effort to bring about a resolution, the mayor at the time, Henry Ford, organized a local committee headed by the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church here in downtown Kalamazoo, a committee of 5 men to look for a resolution. These are mostly professionals, a jeweler, a lawyer, and like one other union member on the committee from another union. And on October 8th, they reported back and said, look, the company just doesn't want to negotiate. They're just not budging. It's the company's like, here's our offer, take it or leave it, no negotiations. So the issues, well, one was that union recognition membership. The steelworkers wanted everybody to be a member of the union, not just the 500 they claimed were members, or the 250 the company claimed. They wanted a closed shop. They wanted members, wanted all workers to be required to join the union. An issue was wages. As was always the case, and this was particularly the case in the post-war years. Prices were soaring in the post-war years. It was a very difficult readjustment after the war. The workers wanted a raise of 10 to 12 cents an hour. The company was offering 4 to 8 cents an hour, depending upon your job and your classification. The minimum wage at the time was about 70 cents an hour, and this was disputed. Today, our minimum wage is $9.25. Back then, 70 cents would have been about $12.60 an hour. So if you were earning the minimum wage, the comparable minimum wage today that they were earning back then, you'd be earning $12.60 an hour. It also says something about where our minimum wage has slid a little over the last few, The company wanted to have a probationary period of 90 days. The union wanted 30 days. The company, the union wants people in faster. There is a question, as you'll see, of the legality. Is this a legal strike? And as the strike progressed, there was a question of, well, who are some of the people the company is hiring to keep the company going? Because obviously there are a fair number of people out there on the picket line. The union claimed that some of these people were in fact being brought in from out of state. That is, and by that primarily Indiana. There's also, it's clear that they're hiring agricultural workers who were, as the harvest season came to an end, agricultural workers were being hired. Well, stick around, you can work here. And also some college students. Western Michigan College's president, Paul Sangren, would ban the university from referring students to work at Shakespeare. Now, he didn't say they couldn't work there, but he said the university had an office that helped place students in jobs, and he said, no referrals. So students go down there on their own, okay, but the university is not going to be a party to referring them down there. We're not going to be sort of recruiting replacement workers. And then there was another question that lurks below the surface. Was Shakespeare already starting to move some of its production out of state? Yes, it was. Not just those 10 workers during the war years, and that Burbank division would grow, but in early 1946, they had moved some 200 production workers to Columbia, South Carolina, and they had started manufacturing their Wonder Rod, a glass rod down in Columbia, South Carolina. They didn't move any of the workers there, but 200 jobs went down there. A smaller number in the line division moved to Iowa. About 30 to 50 workers, or their jobs, only a handful of supervisors went to Iowa where they were manufacturing the fishing lines. So Shakespeare is already starting to sort of move jobs out. So the union is concerned about that. All right, I said there were some disturbances. All right, take a look at this. We're here looking at the Shakespeare Company, and notice what's going on in the street as the supervisors, and also primarily supervisors, are attempting to pull into a parking lot. The strikers are out here blocking the cars, and if you look carefully here, they're literally trying to tip it, to roll it over. They're actually bouncing. You can kind of see this one woman, she's pushing down on the car. So there are some disturbances there. On the picket line, This is what Judge McDonald was blocking. He said, well, you can only have 2 pickets because the picketers were sort of like shoulder to shoulder. And if a strike breaker or a replacement worker wanted to come into work, they had to literally physically push their way in between the pickets. That's why limited to 2. And well, here's another example of this from the inside. Here's this man, somebody, I got to get up here and see if we can find him, but here you can see the picketers all marching in sort of in a circle, and at this point, probably, I think, it's not this man, there's somebody attempting to push, oh, I guess it's this guy here, attempting to push his way in, and they're pushing back, blocking, trying to keep him from entering the plant. Again, just an example of what Judge McDonald was trying to avoid. He didn't want the picketers to physically blockade the entrances to the plant. Now, the national president of the steelworkers at the time was a man by the name of Philip Murray. And I think I got, whoops, wrong button. One of the things was that in 1948, the same year, 47 really, but the Congress in 1947-48, the Congress elected in November of 46, that was in power 47-48 until January of 49, was a Republican Congress, and they passed over President Truman's veto a restrictive measure called the Taft-Hartley Act, which would make it more and more difficult for unions to organize. It would allow states to ban the closed shop, and almost immediately some of the southern states did that. So you got the open, the so-called open shop. You can't be forced to join the union just because you want to work at the company. But as part of that, in the sort of the beginnings of the Cold War, the fear of communist subversion, the Taft-Hartley Act also required all union leaders to sign an affidavit that they were not communists, or that they were not members of any other organization seeking to overthrow the government of the United States. Something on the order of about 60% of the men in the unions who were required, leadership that were required to sign this, in all unions did so, but not all did. And there was a price to be paid for that. If your leadership refused to sign that, then your locals, like that local here, could not appeal to the National Labor Relations Board to intervene, to provide arbitration or mediation, anything like that. You were a recognized union, but you didn't have the full right during a dispute, a labor dispute, to go to the NLRB and say, these guys are engaged in unfair labor practices, or you just could not use them, and that will become an issue later on in the strike as well. So those first pickets, you noticed they were all in shirt sleeves. Here we are now getting into November. They're still out there picketing. As long as they're moving now, they were allowed to have more than 2, but they were not allowed to congregate in front of the doors. So they're moving slowly by, and as happens in strikes to this day, calling out names to those who are crossing the picket line, calling them scabs and the like. And then early December, a Wednesday. National and local headlines. Troops were called in. Well, they weren't. It was state troopers. But there was a CIO raid. Goons had smashed the Shakespeare Factory, flipped over cars. 12 innocent people were injured. This was the terror. These were the communist tactics that had come to Kalamazoo as part of the communist conspiracy. This is actually a little bit later on the day. The terrible raid was over. There are multiple state police on patrol here at each entrance to prevent the events from happening. What happened? Well, on the night of November 30th, steelworkers at the Great Lakes Steel Company in River Rouge organized a meeting and decided they would, and this was probably planned in advance, of course, that they would organize a flying squadron to drive to Kalamazoo the next morning and demonstrate in a, as they said, a peaceful, nonviolent demonstration in support of the strikers. So 150 to 200 of them met at Great Lakes Steel, the Union Hall for Great Lakes Steel. They planned the rally. And then overnight, they drove in a caravan of about 40 cars. Now, there is no interstate out there. You are driving on what was then called US 12. It's today's Michigan Avenue. You may say, oh, wait, US 12 is down around White Pigeon. No, that was US 112 in those days. When 94 was open, they ended having US 12 as a US highway, and they changed 12 down to 112, the number down there. So they're driving across on a two-lane highway, in the dark. They get to Galesburg and rendezvous. So, and this is a pretty challenging, in terms of logistics in and of itself. Everybody get there at approximately the same time, rally, get to Galesburg, find a place that most of them don't know Galesburg, organize themselves, and then from Galesburg drive on in on what we would call Michigan Avenue out there today, and proceed to the plant. Well, the peaceful nonviolent rally becomes violent. We'll talk about that when we get to the trial. The steelworkers from the Detroit area storm the plant. They damage equipment. They flip over automobiles in the management parking lot. A milk truck shows up to deliver milk that day. It gets set on fire, not destroyed, but there is a fire to it. It's not clear how that happened, but because it happened at the time, it was reported as they burned a truck. Well, maybe it was them, probably, but besides those 200 or so men, there were some other 200 to 300 local participants in the demonstration. And the men from Detroit area were called a flying squadron, but were labeled a goon squad. The police said that, well, first of all, the local police said we're just outnumbered. We just try to maintain peace, but we're not going to try to disrupt what's going on. We're just outnumbered. There's too many of them. Plus, they said what the folks from the Detroit area did was they used their cars to block the streets to prevent the police. So they just essentially set up a roadblock. They got 30 or 40 cars from a couple of directions. They literally just park in the street, block the street, making it difficult for the police to come and intervene more forcefully in the events. So a couple pictures from that morning. This was shortly before it happened. It's December, so it's dark when it starts, for one thing. What is going on, it's not really clear. This is afterwards. But the steelworkers from the Detroit area are going to claim that it was all peaceful until there was a gunshot. And then all hell broke loose. But it wasn't their intention to have this violent thing. But there's a gunshot. They don't know who fired it. They assume that they're being fired on. And the whole peaceful rally, if that's what it was intended to be, as opposed to one where they did come in and overturn cars in the management parking lot there. There's in total some 7 cars were overturned, being towed away here. By the way, there are a lot of women who worked at Shakespeare, so there are a lot of women strikers and women who are hired as replacements. So don't be surprised if you have been at the number of women who show up in all of these pictures here, is because some of the work, Shakespeare always had a substantial workforce of women. And the goon squad, or flying squadron, ransacked the building. They've broken out windows. This is one of the management offices over here. You can see the desk. The windows are cracked. Here they've broken out windows. They've smashed. This is a rack where some of the rods were stored. Here's the windows to the doors smashed out. Windows in the hallway smashed out. Things dumped over in the hallways. tools, equipment, products, just more windows. So you can see this is not just they went in. There's some significant damage being done to the plant. And another final picture: spilled brass parts, spilled parts in the machine department, all over the floor. Henry Shakespeare, who was then running the company, William's son, said, "There's no question in my mind that it was communist tactics, but whether Moscow ordered it or not, I couldn't say." But this is again the period of not quite the Red Scare, the beginnings of the Red Scare, but certainly the start of the Cold War. The Shakespeare Company would claim that in 1948 dollars, these raiders did something on the order of $100,000 in damage. At least that's the amount they sued for.
Was anybody arrested for these break-ins, illegal break-ins?
We'll get to that in just a second. There is a trial that comes out of this. So this all happens. Immediately, there is a political investigation. Now, it is a month after the 1948 elections. And from 1947 to 1948, the Republicans controlled the Congress. But in 1948, some of you may remember from a high school history textbook, Harry Truman holding up the newspaper, "Dewey defeats Truman." No, Truman defeated Dewey, and the Democrats regained control of Congress. So Claire Hoffman, who was our representative from the 6th District, a Republican, has literally 1 month as the chair of a subcommittee of the House Committee on Labor, which was, in fact, headed up by Fred Hartley of the Taft-Hartley Act. Hoffman literally has a month to have his own one-man investigation because come January 4th, the new Congress is going to be sworn in, and the Democrats are going to be in charge. So if he's going to make any political hay out of this and talk about communist influence, as he was inclined to do, Hoffman was one of those folks in the 1950s who was claiming that fluoridation would turn everybody into communists, among other negative effects. So he's got literally a month. He calls an investigation. Now, the investigation, first he flies here, or not, well, he does fly here. Then he goes back to Washington, and he has this investigation. He's got literally about 3 weeks, given that the holiday season is in there. And basically, well, I've already said this. He chairs a subcommittee of the House Committee on Labor, and Philip Murray, and other union leaders from other unions simply refuse to cooperate. This is just a witch hunt. How can you have a really good, impartial hearing that you called on 2 days' notice, and you got just a minimum of a few weeks to come to a conclusion? So we're not going to even. This is nonsense. From the criminal side, opposed to the political side, the governor of Michigan, Kim Sigler, appointed a secret one-man grand jury. That is, the proceedings were secret. Everybody knew. He appointed a judge from Jackson to operate as a one-man grand jury to investigate the criminal activities that day. And that would go on regardless of the change of office, because that was a criminal thing. The grand jury was seated. It would continue its investigation regardless of who was in power politically. But Governor Sigler, Claire Hoffman would stay in Congress. She would just be in the minority party. Governor Sigler also lost his seat in '48 election, replaced by Soapy Williams. And in Congress, the House Committee on Labor would be now in the hands of John Lisinski from the Downriver area in Detroit, a strong pro-labor congressman. So this negative, so the Republican side is going to be out of favor from the political side on all of this. Lisinski said that he'll start the investigations all over, both into the incident, how the grand jury is being run, as he was quoted as saying in the paper, Hoffman had no more authority to conduct this investigation than a rabbit. Lisinski and Hoffman would exchange several insults over the coming months, one in which Hoffman demands that Lisinski be expelled because Lisinski called him a pimp for Hitler tactics. And that was just unacceptable. So the political side has changed, but that criminal investigation goes on. Once the grand jury is seated, it continues its work. It's not a political appointment. And after a month, closer to 2 months of hearings, there are indictments that come out against the CIO, mostly against leaders of both of the union at the state level and at the local level from the steelworkers. They're indicted. The judge, John Simpson, issued indictments charging 11 CIO members. 8 were charged with conspiracy to riot. 4 were charged simply with destruction of property. The problem was trying to get reliable witnesses to things that are happening in the dark in a very tumultuous scene. And as you can imagine, nobody from the union side was willing to identify, and the police had, the local police had stood back. So he had, whether you agree with him or not, he had a challenge trying to find evidence, who did what, who threw that rock, who tipped those cars over, But he could go for leadership and charge them with conspiracy to riot. Some had multiple charges. That's the overlap. And there are 11 people. And so you say 11, 8 and 4, that's 12. Well, some had 2 charges. He heard 125 witnesses. 3 of the union men had, in fact, initially refused to cooperate, and he had them jailed for contempt. And eventually they would comply after a couple days in jail. They testified to their role in organizing this flying squadron. They didn't, so backwards here. So that was January. Now there's the interlude while the attorneys and their defendants get together, get the evidence. The union attorneys try to have the indictments thrown out. The judge rejects that. The pretrial hearings, which happen in all trials, will last for about a month. The defendants argued that simply they came here to show support for their fellow trade union activists who were in the strike with a company that was hardline, refusing to negotiate, and then a company security guard fired a shot, and then that's when everything went wrong. It turns out that apparently a company security guard did fire a shot in the air, although even that may have been sort of accidental, that he was kind of like holding, and he was an elderly man. And I can use those terms, I'm elderly, but he was an elderly man to start with, and he, apparently as his arm was bumped, and it was not a shot at anyone into the crowd, but a shot that he probably didn't even intend to fire. So in the end, out of those first 11, finally 8 of the rioters, the judge, and here they bring in a judge from Ann Arbor for the same reason, get a judge. Nobody can say that this judge is biased. We bring an Ann Arbor judge in, and after go through all the pretrial hearings, out of the 11 men who were first charged, 8 of them will go to trial on conspiracy to riot. They basically said there's just not going to be enough evidence to say, you were the 2 people involved in tipping this over, breaking those windows, whatever the damage was. Everybody was responsible, but couldn't pin it really on anyone. So the trial finally begins May 31st, and a man by the name of Charles Younglove, who was the president of the River Rouge local, testified that, in fact, yes, he did recruit these men over in River Rouge. He did pay them $10 each for their time that day. That's not insignificant. Remember that 70 cents translating into $12.60? So $10, they're probably getting pretty close to $150 to $200 for this. Of course, they got to drive their cars over. They don't get the kind of mileage we do. Well, of course, gas was cheaper too, but still. And so Younglove says that he was one of the guys who was thrown into prison or in jail for refusing to testify to the grand jury, to the judge. Once he has testified to that judge on the grand jury, he has to pretty much stick to that same testimony in trial, or he could be charged with perjury. So they got what he said. He said, yeah, so he said to the grand jury, this is what he did. Now in court, he has to say that. In court, he does have to say that. But now, in response to a lot of other questions, well, he's not quite sure. He thinks that might have happened. He's so reluctant to answer the prosecutor's questions that the judge eventually rules him, even though he's a prosecution witness, a hostile witness. But he does have to testify that, yes, he was the one who organized all of this and paid them. But he also got immunity. As you can imagine in this kind of trial, it's conflicting. He said, she said, no. One side said, the other side said. The union side said everything else was fine, was going fine. All was serene at the goon riot, the CIO aide said. On the other hand, a woman who was going to work that day testified that she had been shoved and she had been slashed. It was a minor cut, but she was cut. The most serious injury that occurred to anybody was apparently some of the strikers, or maybe from the Detroit area, it's not clear who, did chase one worker, one attempted strike-breaking worker, chased him when he tried to break the picket lines, and as they chased him, he fell and broke a leg. And that's the most serious injury. The verdict, well, as I say, it's the first trial because the trial lasts from May 31st to July 29th. Part of that has to do with finding an unbiased jury because this is Kalamazoo. We're a small community. We still are. A high-profile trial like this, they go through probably several hundred jurors with one side or the other. The prosecution is not likely to accept a union member on the jury. Just, the union attorneys, defending the defense attorneys, will have their own standards. It takes a while to get a jury. Nevertheless, at the time, it was said that this was the longest trial in Kalamazoo County history in terms of lasting almost 8 weeks. And the jury deadlocked eventually on August the 2nd, 6-6. There was some report that initially the vote was a 9-3 for acquittal, which is to say the evidence didn't persuade the jurors. The jury was also 9 women and 3 men. But it's not clear that that's the 9-3 split because that was secrecy. But then almost immediately there were reports of some improprieties with the jury. And while it was never proven to the satisfaction of the judge that anyone was penalized, was held in contempt of court, or it does appear that some union members or their sympathizers contacted jurors at home or rode next to them on the public transportation and just talked about the strike, which the juror is not supposed to do. But if you're a known union sympathizer and you call a juror on the trial who's on the trial up at home, well, you're not just calling to see what the weather is or if you can get a recipe. Even if you don't say, hold these guys innocent, just the simple fact that you, a union sympathizer, are calling a member of the jury certainly has the appearance of impropriety. The judge cannot confirm to his satisfaction that this influenced the trial, but the prosecution then says, well, since it was deadlocked 6-6, we want a new trial. And that new trial was approved on August the 19th. That's when it's ordered. It's going to be a while till we get around to that trial. The final verdict finally comes October 6, 1949, and rather than a trial, the prosecution agrees to reduce charges for 5 leaders of the goon raid and puts them on probation on a lesser charge. His argument was that simply, look how long the jury selection was the last time. And we're going to go through the same thing again. Better to get these guys. And so they were required to pay $1,000. Again, that doesn't sound particularly high to us, but that's probably somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000, depending on how you calculate the money. So it is a significant fine, and they're on probation for a year. But you know, the trial, you know, the big Shakespeare but what's the final outcome of the strike? This is the trial. Well, there were two mediated efforts. Now, as I said, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, could not, you know, the union could not appeal to them because of Murray's refusal to sign the non-communist oath. But they did get a couple of private mediators in. One, a Catholic priest from the Detroit area who apparently, I didn't recognize his name, had been successful in mediating these efforts. They failed. It eventually came down to the fact that the company was saying, A, you know, you don't have, you know, we're continuing to operate, so we have no reason really to change our position. You know, this is it. We got a full work staff here, whether some of them are strike breakers or scabs or whatever you want to call them, you know, we're working. Why should we change? Besides, the company argued, you don't represent the majority of the workers. But in October, now this is October 49, back to old Judge McDonald, he rules that ultimately the strike itself was illegal because the union was supposed to have held a strike vote of all the employees to see if they wanted to go out on strike. And they had not done that. They had done either the leadership or the card-carrying members. So McDonald says the strike itself was illegal. And the union is done for 14 years because we don't know it's not until 63 that the steelworkers once again file the cards, as they're called, filing that you've got enough support, more than 50% of the workforce looking for, that's willing to vote for a union. Same thing happens to this very day. If you've got an unorganized place and you want to organize a union, what you have to do is you collect cards from 50% of the members saying, yes, we would vote, we'd like to have a vote on the union. And it's 63. In 70, the Shakespeare Company headquarters moved down to South Carolina, where they had moved that Wonder Rod production back in 46. And in 1989, the new owners of Spearflex closed the Kalamazoo operations completely. So the strike fails. Slowly, the Shakespeare Company and its successor, Spearflex, will all leave Kalamazoo. And those buildings will sit rather empty for a long time. Plaza Corp gets them early in this century. And the Shakespeare's Pub seems to have been a very successful operation. Sometimes, I have to tell this story all the time when I talk about Shakespeare. I one time was asked by a reporter for a local television station that I won't name. But that station was this is about 20 years ago, right after we had opened the museum. But Oprah was having a program on her nationally syndicated show about inventors, and especially local inventors, people you don't know about. And so the local station thought they would find out at the museum about local inventors. So I'm going around saying, well, we got Dr. Upjohn with the friable pill, we got Dr. Stryker with the circle electric bed, and other things as well, I pointed them out. And then I said, of course, here's the rod and reel, here's the Shakespeare Company, organized by William Shakespeare. And the Cub reporter goes, Shakespeare? Jr., you mean? You don't know how much I wanted to say, yeah, it was his grandson, the playwright's grandson. Because it was quite clear that that's what this reporter really thought when I said Shakespeare Jr. So, the other little story here is, what about our friend William Shakespeare Jr.? As I said, he was not deceased at this time. He was no longer active in the company, he was not the day-to-day active in the company. His son Henry was running the company. And curiously, in 1915, he was the socialist candidate for mayor of Kalamazoo. Was he a socialist? For a long time, I wondered, but thought, well, I also knew that at that time, he was in favor of, he wanted the city to build a public lighting system to provide electricity for public buildings, the streets, rather than use a commercial electric service. A lot of cities were doing that back at the turn of the 20th century as they were bringing public lighting to buildings, parks, streets, and the. He wanted that. But neither the Democrats nor the Republicans were in favor of that plan. So I said, you know what? He's just a single issue candidate, and the socialist ticket was a way to get his viewpoint out there. People would hear this, they might vote for him, not because he was a socialist, but because, well, this is the way for them to think about this. Family lore might suggest otherwise. The Shakespeares still have descendants in the area. I don't know if you've had Eric Jeska here to talk about fishing lures and stuff. He collects them. His great uncle was Henry Jackson, or was it? I forget. It doesn't matter. Eric is a descendant of the Shakespeares. I was talking to him about the strike and about the curiosity of Shakespeare being a socialist, and really he wasn't. He was just a proponent of public lighting. And Eric says to me, well, the family lore is, no, he was a socialist. He was a Debsian socialist. That was the heyday of Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party, American Socialist Party back then. And he was really committed to that. And when the first picket lines went up in September, he was in his office, and apparently Henry noticed the picket lines and said something, and this is family lore, I can't document this, but Henry said, supposedly said to somebody there, oh hell, get Dad home before he's out there on the picket line with those damn strikers. Because he was the family lore was that he would have been sympathetic. Whether he was sympathetic after the Goon Squad riot of December, I don't know. But in September, when the first pickets went up, that's what and Eric has told me, oh yes, the daughter has told me, yep, that was it. So whether or not, but it's a little bit of fun in the family lore about the strike. So that's my story. I'll be happy to take questions from you about the strike or anything related to it. But I think it really kind of illustrates both labor relations in Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo does not have the same kind of strong labor history in terms of organized. Now, there are unions in Kalamazoo, both AFL and CIO unions, but this is not Detroit or Cleveland or Pittsburgh, what we think of as really strong labor towns, in part because a lot of companies, Upjohn, for example, a big company, was very paternalistic. The paper mills, which employed the most workers, were all AFL, and the AFL was always a lot more conservative, and they were around before the Great Depression. We had unions back here to the 1860s. Cigar workers had a union, printers and typographers had a union, but we're just not a union town in the same sense that, as I say, you could say about, say, a city like Detroit. So, yes?
So you were pointing out the number of women
Yeah.
in the pictures. This is after World War II, when the men went to war, the women filled the spots, as well as the blacks from the South, too. But
Sure.
you didn't see many blacks, in the factories at that time. So it's not surprising to see women in the factories. And the question would be is, the other industries here, was it a similar percentage of women that were there? And then the third question is, as far as the salary or compensation and reimbursement, did they get the same reimbursement as the male?
Well, I'll go in reverse order. I really doubt they got the same pay scale. That what I said at the beginning, that they wanted raises from 4 to 10 cents, or offered 4 to 10 cents an hour, and they wanted 8 to 12, probably suggests that the positions that the women held were the ones who were at the 8 cents an hour and men at 12 cents an hour. That's just the way it was in those days, and maybe even in some cases to this day. As far as were they hired for the war years, and this goes also kind of answers your first two questions, Shakespeare always had a lot of women. A lot of the work at the Shakespeare Company was other than working those grinding machines in the men, there was a lot of fine hand work, and it was often considered that was work that was suited for women. It was kind of repetitive, working with the lines, things like that, where it didn't come to operating machinery. Now, some of the women may have, well, most women who were hired during the war were hired for the duration. And women who were, and this happened throughout industry. Well, war ended, the women got dumped for the men returning. And those weren't all women who had means, who could fall back on other things. A lot of them were on their own. They may have been widows, they may have been single mothers, they may have been the support of their family, but they were just out. And that happened across the country. So I suspect that the women who were working at Shakespeare, many of them were working there before the war years. And there's a series, the library has some of those, Beth, those are, I think, the photos. Mamie Austin photos. A wonderful photographer of Kalamazoo in the 20th century, Mamie Austin. And if you look at those pictures, you'll see a surprising number of women. There's at least 4 to 6 of them that show workers in the workplace at Shakespeare, and there are women there, and so that wouldn't be unusual. As far as the African Americans, unlikely not there, unless there was some. But Kalamazoo has a fair-sized African-American community, but not large. It really grows after the war years as industrial workers, African-Americans who are doing some industrial work, especially along the lake shore in manufacturing boats, their jobs are eliminated and they come in. There's really a notable influx in the years between 45 and 50, so much so that in 48 there is a sort of a human rights organization that looks into the status of African Americans, because there is a notable increase in the size of the community. The community then, as now, had a real lack of affordable housing, and so it was leading to some tensions, and they go through. And I haven't read that report for years. I'm sure they've got it in the local history room down here. But it goes through some of the major employers and talks about the number of African Americans, and it's a very low number. Even a place like Upjohn will have single, maybe low double-digit African American employees, and their excuse is, well, my other workers won't work next to an African American. Yeah. So, what's that?
They would if they wanted money.
But the employer, well, that was the employer's excuse, essentially. It was, I don't want this. Or I'd have to have separate facilities. We're up north, but people think that segregation was only in the South. Well, it was in the law in the South, but in the North, there was a lot of segregation by custom, and you knew where you could go, when you could go. This is off the subject, but Arthur Washington, who was the first African American on both the city and the county commission, the Justice Department, Justice Building down on Crosstown Parkway is named for Art. Art he's passed away some years ago now. Art tells the story when he was hired, the committee, and he was hired to work as a social work and a recreational worker based on his degrees from his master's degree from MSU. And apparently, whoever was in charge of locating housing for him had rented a house. And then when Art showed up, they said, oh, well, we're going to have to find a different place, because they had put him in a white neighborhood. And they then gave him a list of places where he could shop at any time, places where he could shop or eat before 6 o'clock. And there's no law on that. That was just custom. People knew. You didn't eat. I don't know if anybody in here is related to the Schensels, but the Schensels cafeteria for a long time, no, not at all. And there were other places like that. But that's the kind of thing that I would use as evidence to say Shakespeare was no different. Yeah.
Okay, so if World War II, a lot of companies are switching to wartime manufacturing.
Required.
Did Shakespeare change anything, or did you fishing drills through the
No, they did a lot of change. I don't know all of the products that they made, but they were making controls for aircraft controls and a variety of. I don't know, but they certainly did change. But I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But they did change, and there is the change back, the reconversion to peacetime production is why there was so much labor unrest in the years from 46 to 48 as companies struggled. Shakespeare complains, as a number of companies complained, that they had difficulty accessing necessary raw materials. The Kalamazoo Stove Company, among other reasons, not the only reason, Kalamazoo Stove Company can't get enough steel to make stoves. You know, after the war, and it's one of the reasons Kalamazoo Stove goes up. One of the reasons. There are a number of others, but yes, I do know that they changed. So they did have war production, and they did not. I mean, they may have made some rods and reels, but I doubt very many. There wouldn't have been much of a wartime use for it. Although, you know, I mean, even at a company like the Gibson Company, which also heavily shifts its production to wartime production. Women, Gibson Girls, a book, tells about the women who made guitars during the war years because you got all these USO troops and going around visiting the troops, need to make music. Plus, you don't want the folks at home to be sacrificing everything. So some rods and reels and sporting equipment would have been made to the extent that it didn't really impact on the need for raw materials because. But people at home suffered a lot, but they by the same token, the government didn't want them to be absolutely nothing to do with your money. So, yeah.
With the violent
Yeah.
attack that evening, that morning, what happened to the people that were striking? Was everything just halted in the judicial system? Obviously fell off because they had enough replacement workers. They didn't need those strikers. Did they just grow tired of striking?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Demands wouldn't be met, or was there judicial action to halt them from continuing the strike?
Well, the strike was declared illegal, so.
That was cease and desist.
So that was, yeah. At that point, it would have been it was declared illegal. They couldn't have continued to strike. They would have then had the choice of either going back as a replacement worker if the company would have them. A lot of times, an employer would not take back a striking worker, or moving on. And it's not clear by after the events, and especially as we get into January, to what extent the strike continues. Picketing does continue. There is, there continue to be court hearings before Judge McDonald about the picketing. So we know that the picketing goes on, but the extent to which it has the support of a sizable number of Shakespeare workers, it's hard to say. Probably diminishing. I think after that event and everything, a lot of workers recognized that this really hurt the strike. And probably slowly. And after 3 months like that, a lot of workers, people don't have savings. They're finally saying, okay, it doesn't look promising. What do I do? I'll see if I can say something to my former boss. Like, well, if you ever need me back, or can I come back? Do I still have a job? It's pretty typical at the end of a failing strike. Yeah.
Were there any other strikes of note in Kalamazoo history?
Well, in terms of violence, I don't know of any others that are that violent. There are other strikes, and off the top of my head, I couldn't go through all. The most famous was a strike of women corset workers at the Kalamazoo Corset Company in 1912, involving something on the order of 1,000 to 1,200 women, and it too failed, but it was over wages, over hours, over working conditions, over allegations of sexual harassment. In that strike, the women said that some of the women did some of the sewing, had to literally pay for their thread. It was deducted from their wages, the thread they used. But that the foreman would come along and say, yeah, we can forget about putting that, knocking that off of your wages this week. Are you free Saturday night? But that was a big strike. And that was about 1,000 to 1,100 workers. So, yeah. So,
Well, I saw a reference online to William Shakespeare Jr. being a Fabian socialist.
Who was
and
that?
John too. I was just
oh, a
wondering-
Fabian socialist?
Yeah, I was just wondering what that means.
The Fabian socialists were sort of believed that people would come around, and it's been too long since my political theory classes but there are a whole host of socialists, and some simply believed that in time people would come to recognize there was a better way to organize the society that was less cutthroat than capitalism. And so you've got the Fabians are very, very idealistic. People will just sort of come around. You have so-called Fourierist socialists who believed in organizing labor communally. And River Oaks Park out on Michigan Avenue, is it River Oaks, the park out there, was where the Alphadelphia commune was located in the 1840s. So there's a whole host of social, at the time, and part of the reason why Albert Todd was a speaker at socialist meetings, and you could find ministers at the time who are socialists. Now, wasn't necessarily Marxist socialism, but there was people were very much aware at the end of the 19th century of the huge divide between the wealthy and the poor. And more so than today. We can say, oh, well, there's an equal divide in terms of the shares of wealth between the gilded wealthy 1% today and the 99%. But the 99% today have pretty much a safety net that didn't exist back then. Back 100 years ago, 125 years ago, the poor, it was sink or swim. Today, and I know we're cutting it back, and won't get into the politics of that, but we've got, there's supplemental nutrition programs, there's assistance and Medicaid, a whole variety of programs that help people from literally living in hovels in the streets when their jobs are gone. That wasn't the case 125 years ago. So people were willing to listen to people who proclaimed ideas. One of the best-selling books of 1899 was a book called Looking Backwards by Edward Bellamy. And some of you might have read that in a political science class, in which this guy falls asleep, a lot like Rip Van Winkle, wakes up 100 years in the future, and there's this wonderfully harmonious, smoothly operating socialist economy and country, and he's like, well, how did this happen? Oh, well, things got rough for a little while, and then people sort of said, we don't need to be cutthroat and killing each other. There's enough to go around, and kind of thing. And people back then actually were getting into it. So people like, I know for sure Todd, I don't know about Upjohn, but elsewhere across the country, you find these wealthy, some leaders of industry and the like, who are willing to say, yeah, eventually we've got to come to a better way of doing things. Excuse me. The Fabians were heavily out of England, I know that. But it's been too long since I took a political theory class to quite remember exactly what the Fabians were about. But I know their name, and as I say, an idealistic effort. But they weren't communal in the way that the Fourierists were, or New Harmony, Indiana, where people would all voluntarily come together, pool their wealth, then all work for the common good, share the wealth, and they would set an example, and then sooner or later everybody would go that way. I mean, the guy Evans who starts the movement that becomes like New Harmony, Indiana, which is one of the most famous of these Fourierist settlements, is a wealthy British industrialist. I forget exactly what field, but yeah.
How does Ted Williams fit in with the Shakespeare family? He was one that believed in strikes too. He had 3 of them.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was very close to the Shakespeare family. He was a walking, talking salesman came along after the strike.
Yeah, I don't know of the relationship. I suspect he was a sportsman and was he into fishing, and therefore they therefore probably just hired him just to, as today LeBron James is promoting some tennis shoe and and the like. And then in those days, maybe it was a little bit you were closer together than just a purely commercial relationship. You might end up as friends, or so.
So we know they went out of business, but what happened to the
Oh,
reels and rods?
They didn't go out of business. The strike was illegal, but they moved their production elsewhere.
No, but I mean derivatively, like today, the different parts, the aeronautical parts, the automotive parts, and the fishing parts.
Oh, some of those companies are still in operation. They're down in South Carolina. They're out in Las Vegas. They manufacture, archery supplies, golf equipment, and the like. If you are one of those people who, really like to watch like ESPN 72, where they have fishing tournaments on TV and stuff, what kind of pleasure anyone could derive from watching a fishing tournament. I'm one of those that's like watch golf. That would seem to be a thrill a minute compared to watching a fishing tournament. But watch them one of those sometimes, and you will see Shakespeare is one of the sponsors, because they are still they're still out there making some of those products. Whether they're still doing aeronautical or whether they were sold off, that no. But the sporting goods side of it is still in operation.
As a Shakespeare derivative company, or did somebody buy the product?
It's called Shakespeare. Well, I don't know that the Shakespeare family is a major investor in it anymore or not. They may have some, but they bought. I'm sure there's another corporation long since taken it over, taken the name but the name is still out there. Yeah. All right. Well, I hope you don't mind giving us an evening. So.